Alright, let's talk dirty money, or more specifically, the groups trying to stop dirty money. Look, no one likes doing their taxes, but imagine if instead of paying taxes, you just didn't. And instead, you use that money to, let's say, buy a yacht, but like a really, really big yacht. One of those ones shaped like a smaller, more ostentatious yacht. That's essentially what money laundering is, except instead of buying yachts, probably, criminals use complex schemes to disguise illegal funds as legitimate income. It's a global problem that requires a global response, which is where these fine folks come in. Think of them as the Avengers, but instead of stopping Thanos, they're trying to stop your mildly evil neighbor from buying a slightly used jet ski with drug money. We're diving deep into the world of anti-money laundering, AML, regulatory bodies. You know, those organizations with names that sound like they were randomly generated by a bureaucrat on a deadline. But don't let the acronyms fool you. These groups are the front line in the fight against financial crime. Over the next little while, we'll explore the key organizations that set and enforce AML standards globally and in specific countries. We'll be going through a lot of acronyms, so I hope you brought flashcards, or at least the mental capacity to remember what any of these letters stand for once this video is over. By the end of this video, you'll be able to impress your friends with your newfound knowledge of international finance regulations. Or, at the very least, you'll be able to bore them into oblivion. Either way, a win's a win. First up, we have the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, to its friends, and by friends I mean the countries forced to listen to them. They're kind of like the United Nations of dirty money, except instead of sending in peacekeepers, they issue strongly worded recommendations. And countries actually listen, because no one wants to be known as the place where dirty money goes to party. FATF sets the global standards for combating money laundering and terrorist financing. They don't have any actual enforcement power because that would be crazy, right? Imagine a world where one organization could just waltz into a country and start seizing assets. It would be chaos. But they do issue these lovely reports where they publicly shame countries that aren't doing enough to fight financial crime. And no one wants to be shamed in front of the whole world, right? So yeah, FATF. They're like the quiet kid in class who also happens to be a black belt in karate and knows where you bury all your secrets. You don't want to mess with them. Next up we have the Egmont Group. Imagine a global group chat where instead of sharing memes, they're sharing financial intelligence. It's like WhatsApp, but for spies who fight money laundering. The Egmont Group is all about international cooperation among financial intelligence units, or FIUs, which are like the detectives of the financial world. Except instead of trench coats and fedoras, they have spreadsheets and an unhealthy obsession with suspicious activity reports. They share information and coordinate their efforts to track down dirty money trails across borders. Because let's face it, criminals don't really care about borders. They're like, oh, you have a rule against laundering money from illegal penguin poaching in this country? Fine, I'll just take my business to another country that doesn't have such silly regulations. It's like trying to stop a mosquito with a chain-link fence. That's where the Egmont Group comes in. They're like the duct tape of international AML efforts, holding everything together and preventing the whole system from falling apart. Now let's talk about the Wolfsburg Group. This is where things get a little bit awkward. The Wolfsburg Group is made up of 13 big banks that got together and said, you know what? Maybe we should try not to be the bad guys all the time. It's like when a group of teenagers who have been relentlessly bullying someone suddenly realize that maybe, just maybe, they've been a little bit mean. They develop AML guidelines for the financial industry, kind of like setting the rules for how to not get caught doing something you're not supposed to be doing in the first place. It's a bit like a fox teaching a chicken coop security. The good news is that they're at least trying, which is more than we can say for some other groups. But, you know, keep your expectations in check. It's still a group of banks setting their own rules. It's like trusting a wolf to guard the henhouse, or a politician to be honest, or a YouTuber to be humble. You get the idea. Now let's head over to the United States where we meet FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. These guys are like the Batman of the US Treasury Department, except instead of fighting crime in a cape and cowl, they fight financial crime in khakis and a sensible cardigan. They're all about tracking suspicious financial flows, analyzing data, and generally making life difficult for money launderers. FinCEN is the primary AML regulator in the US, and they don't mess around. They have the power to impose hefty fines, shut down businesses, and even throw people in jail. They're like the IRS, but with more power and less of a sense of humor. So if you're thinking about laundering some money through a US bank, you might want to think again, because FinCEN is watching, and they're not afraid to use their powers for good, or at least for legally mandated compliance. Speaking of not messing around, let's talk about OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control. These are the folks who decide who the US doesn't like, and then make it really, really difficult for them to do business. They're like the popular kids in high school, except instead of spreading rumors, they freeze assets and impose travel bans. OFAC enforces sanctions against countries, individuals, and entities that the US government deems to be a threat to national security or foreign policy interests. Basically, if you're on OFAC's bad side, you're not going to be buying a plane ticket to Disney World anytime soon. So if you're planning on doing business with anyone on OFAC's naughty list, you might want to reconsider, unless of course you're a fan of having your assets frozen and your travel plans ruined. Now let's hop across the pond to the United Kingdom, where we meet the Financial Conduct Authority, or FCA. They're like the UK's version of FinCEN, but with slightly more charming accents and slightly less power, but let's not dwell on that. The FCA is responsible for AML supervision in the UK, making sure that financial institutions are following the rules and not letting dirty money slip through the cracks. They're like the headmaster of a very posh boarding school, except instead of caning students who misbehave, they issue fines and revoke licenses. So, if you're a financial institution operating in the UK, you'd better be on your best behavior, because the FCA is watching, and they have a very low tolerance for shenanigans. Now let's head over to mainland Europe, where we have the European Banking Authority, or EBA. They're responsible for developing EU-wide AML guidelines, which is no easy feat when you're dealing with 27 different countries, each with their own languages, cultures, and banking systems. It's like trying to herd cats. Except these cats are wearing ties, carrying briefcases, and speaking different languages. But somehow, the EBA manages to wrangle them all together and come up with a set of AML guidelines that everyone can, mostly, agree on. So, if you're a bank operating in the EU, you need to be familiar with the EBA's guidelines, because they're the law of the land, or at least the law of the European Union, which is kind of the same thing but also not at all. Now let's meet the muscle behind the EU's AML efforts, Europol. They're like the EU's version of the FBI, but with better pastries, and slightly less jurisdiction, but again, let's not dwell on that. Europol is responsible for AML enforcement in the EU. They work with national law enforcement agencies to investigate and prosecute cross-border financial crime. They're like the international crime-fighting team from your favorite buddy cop movie, but with less explosions and more paperwork. So if you're a criminal thinking about moving your ill-gotten gains through the EU, you might want to reconsider, because Europol is on the case, and they're not afraid to use their international reach to bring you to justice, or at least to extradite you to a country with a less favorable extradition treaty. And of course, we can't forget about the financial intelligence units, or FIUs, in each EU country. They're like the local sheriffs of the AML world, responsible for enforcing AML regulations on the ground. They collect and analyze suspicious activity reports, work with local businesses to prevent money laundering, and generally make sure that their little corner of the EU is a hostile environment for financial criminals. It's like a neighborhood watch, but for money laundering. Except instead of carrying flashlights and walkie-talkies, they carry calculators and copies of the AML regulations. And instead of chasing down teenagers who are spray painting graffiti, they're chasing down criminals who are trying to launder money through shell companies and offshore accounts. FinTrack keeping Canada's finances clean, eh? Now let's head north to Canada, where we meet FinTrack, the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Center of Canada. They're like the Mounties of the Canadian financial system, except instead of riding horses and wearing red serge, they analyze financial data and wear sensible shoes. FinTrack is responsible for AML enforcement in Canada, making sure that Canadian businesses are following the rules and reporting suspicious activity. They're like the friendly face of Canadian law enforcement, but don't let their politeness fool you. They're serious about fighting financial crime. So, if you're thinking about laundering some money through Canada, you might want to think again. Because FinTrack is watching, and they're not afraid to slap you with a hefty fine, and then apologize for it because they're Canadian. Austrac, no laundering down under. Now let's head down under to Australia where we meet Austrec, the Australian Transaction Reports and Analysis Centre. They're like the Steve Irwin of the Australian financial system, except instead of wrestling crocodiles, they wrestle with money launderers. Austrac is responsible for AML compliance in Australia, making sure that Australian businesses are following the rules and reporting suspicious activity. They're like the lifeguards of the Australian financial system, keeping an eye out for sharks and other dangers lurking in the water. So, if you're thinking about laundering some money through Australia, you might want to think again. Because Austrac is watching and they're not afraid to throw you in the slammer, right after they finish their Vegemite sandwich. FIU India's Financial Intelligence Gurus. Now let's head over to India, where we meet the Financial Intelligence Unit, India, or FIU Indi for short. They're like the Bollywood version of FinCEN, except instead of singing and dancing, they analyze financial data and chase down money launderers. FIU Indi is responsible for AML monitoring in India, keeping an eye out for suspicious financial activity and working with other agencies to investigate and prosecute financial crime. They're like the detectives of the Indian financial system, using their skills of deduction and their knowledge of the local landscape to track down criminals. So, if you're thinking about laundering some money through India, you might want to reconsider, because FIU Indi is on the case, and they're not afraid to bring you to justice, and maybe even make a Bollywood movie about it. Speaking of India, we can't forget about the Reserve Bank of India, or RBI, which is like the grandparent of Indian financial institutions. They're the ones who set the rules for banks in India. RBI is responsible for AML enforcement for banks in India, making sure they comply with all the regulations. They're like the strict but loving head of the family, making sure everyone is following the rules and behaving themselves. So, if you're a bank in India, you better make sure you're on the RBI's good side, because they have the power to make your life very difficult if you step out of line, and no one wants to disappoint their grandparents, right? Now let's head over to China, where we meet the Anti-Money Laundering Bureau of the People's Bank of China, or PBOC AMLB for short. They're like the Great Firewall of China, but for money laundering. PBOC AMLB is responsible for AML regulation in China, setting the rules for financial institutions and making sure they're following them. They're like the guardians of the Chinese financial system, protecting it from the dangers of money laundering. So, if you're thinking about laundering some money through China, you might want to reconsider, because the PBOC AMLB is watching, and they have a lot of ways to make your life difficult. Now let's head over to Singapore, where we meet the Monetary Authority of Singapore, or MAS. They're like the strict but fair teacher of the Singaporean financial system, making sure everyone is following the rules and no one is cheating. MAS is responsible for AML CFT enforcement in Singapore, making sure that financial institutions are complying with the regulations and reporting suspicious activity. They're known for having a zero-tolerance policy towards financial crime, which is probably why Singapore has a reputation for being squeaky clean. So, if you're thinking about laundering some money through Singapore, you might want to reconsider, because MAS is watching, and they will not hesitate to throw the book at you. And while we're in Singapore, let's not forget about the Suspicious Transaction Reporting Office, or STRO. They're like the detectives of the Singaporean financial system, investigating suspicious activity and working with other agencies to prosecute financial crime. STRO is Singapore's FIU, responsible for receiving and analyzing suspicious transaction reports from financial institutions. They're like the eyes and ears of the Singaporean financial system, always on the lookout for anything that seems out of place. So, if you're a criminal thinking about laundering money through Singapore, you better be really good at covering your tracks, because STRO is watching, and they're really good at what they do. Now, let's head over to Hong Kong, where we meet the Joint Financial Intelligence Unit, or JFIU. They're like the fusion cuisine of financial intelligence units, combining the best of both worlds from law enforcement and financial regulation. The JFIU is responsible for AML enforcement in Hong Kong, working with other agencies to investigate and prosecute financial crime. They're like the special forces of the Hong Kong financial system, trained to deal with the most complex and challenging cases. So, if you're thinking about laundering some money through Hong Kong, you might want to reconsider, because the JFIU is watching, and they have the skills and resources to bring you to justice. Now, let's head over to the United Arab Emirates, where we meet the Financial Intelligence Unit, or UAE FIU. They're like the guardians of the desert, protecting the UAE financial system from the dangers of money laundering and terrorist financing. The UAE FIU is responsible for AML reporting in the UAE, receiving and analyzing suspicious transaction reports from financial institutions, and working with other agencies to investigate and prosecute financial crime. They're like the oasis in the desert for those who are committed to fighting financial crime, providing a safe haven for information sharing and collaboration. So, if you're thinking about laundering some money through the UAE, you might want to reconsider. Because the UAE FIU is watching, and they're not afraid to use their powers to protect their country from financial crime. And while we're in the UAE, let's not forget about the Central Bank of the UAE, or CBUAE. They're like the sheriff of the UAE banking system, making sure everyone is following the rules and no one is getting away with anything funny. The CBUAE is responsible for AML supervision in the UAE, making sure that banks are complying with the regulations and reporting suspicious activity. They're like the watchful eyes in the sky, keeping a close eye on everything that's happening in the UAE financial system. So, if you're a bank operating in the UAE, you better make sure you're on the CBUAE's good side, because they have the power to make your life very difficult if you step out of line. And no one wants to mess with the sheriff, right? And finally, let's head over to Germany, where we meet the Financial Intelligence Unit, FIU, Germany, also known as the Central Office for Financial Transaction Investigations, FIUDE. They're like the well-oiled machine of the German financial system, efficiently and effectively combating money laundering and terrorist financing. The FIU Germany is responsible for AML enforcement in Germany, receiving and analyzing suspicious transaction reports from financial institutions and working with other agencies to investigate and prosecute financial crime. They're like the engineers of the German financial system, designing and implementing systems to prevent and detect financial crime. So if you're thinking about laundering some money through Germany, you might want to reconsider, because the FIU Germany is watching, and they have a reputation for being thorough, meticulous, and relentless in their pursuit of financial criminals. So there you have it, a whirlwind tour of the world's top AML regulatory bodies. We've met the Avengers of financial crime fighting, from the global players setting the standards to the local heroes enforcing them. Remember, these organizations play a crucial role in keeping the global financial system clean and preventing criminals from profiting from their crimes. They might not wear capes or have superpowers, but they're doing important work, often behind the scenes, to protect our financial system. That's a wrap on our overview of the top AML regulatory bodies. Stay informed and compliant to help combat money laundering globally. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more insightful content.